Are we up, Mike? I don't. Which window is that glare coming from? I think it's this one. There we go. Well, maybe it won't matter. Yeah, I think it is. I can see your head moves. Yeah. All right then. We'll live with it. There we go. All right. We're finishing up. I guess I have no choice. We're finishing up today. We have spent the last 2 years getting ready for the arrival of Christ, showing how the Lord has worked from eternity past. The church was a part of God's plan from eternity past. Even though the prophets of the Old Testament, they didn't see the church in the prophecies. It was one of the mysteries of God that was held back until New Testament times. But God planned for the church from eternity past, and we showed how through Old Testament foreshadows and types, the church was going to go. As we look back in retrospect, we can see how the church was foreshadowed in the Old Testament. Mostly this year we've been looking at that period of time between the close of the Old Testament and the New, showing how the Gentile kingdoms all played their role in preparing the world for the coming of Christ. And we spent a lot of our time focusing on Daniel and the prophecies of Daniel relative to all those Gentile empires that would come and go and the roles they would all play in preparing the world for Christ. This last little series we've been working on are those groups and people that came into existence during the Hellenistic period when Jerusalem was under the control of the Greek kings, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. And I guess today would be appropriate. I had a few groups I wanted to look at, but I'm going to cast them aside. I'm going to spend today looking at the last major group that was in opposition to Christ and really played a sinister role in bringing about his death, and that's the Sanhedrin. So we want to look at the Sanhedrin, who they were and what they were, and a little background on the Jewish legal system. Okay? The Jewish legal system was broken down basically into three tiers. The lowest tier was here, the house of judgment called the Beth Din. This happens okay, here we go. Nearly all cities had a house of judgment, and they consisted of a 3-man panel of judges. They handled the lesser issues that would come up, contracts, torts, civil disagreements, landlord-tenant, I suppose, in today's terminology, that sort of thing. Like I said, contracts and disputes. They handled some criminal cases where the punishment would be restricted to lashes. Anything more serious than that would be referred to the next higher court. Then we had the Lesser Sanhedrin. A Lesser Sanhedrin, depending on who you look at, Josephus breaks Judea down into 5 districts where there were Lesser Sanhedrins. A Lesser Sanhedrin usually consisted of 23 members, and you'll notice that both the Lesser and the Greater Sanhedrin, they try to keep the number an odd number so that they preclude the possibility of ties in rendering a decision. So the Lesser Sanhedrin consisted of 23 members. The Great Sanhedrin of Jerusalem, which we will look at, could also often function as a Lesser Sanhedrin with only 23 instead of the prescribed 71 for the Greater Sanhedrin. And I believe, this is only my opinion, I believe it was a Lesser Sanhedrin that condemned Christ to death, because it is clear, looking at the scriptures, that many of the members of the Sanhedrin were not there to oppose what they were doing. We don't see any record of Nicodemus or Joseph of Arimathea being there and voicing their opposition to what the Sanhedrin was doing and bringing Christ and destroying him. So the 23 member panel would act on most lesser matters. They would sit as the Great Sanhedrin when there were matters of national importance, or a 23-member panel could not reach a conclusive verdict. and they handled most of the cases that would result in capital punishment for the accused. The Great Sanhedrin, this is the one that was located in Jerusalem. At the time of Rome, the Great Sanhedrin had jurisdiction only over Judea and Jerusalem. While Jesus Christ was ministering in Galilee, the Great Sanhedrin had no legal authority over that region, therefore they could not lay hold of him while he was in Galilee. It was when he came to Jerusalem that he came under their jurisdiction, and they were able to use their authority to take control of him. Consists of 71 members. Usually the president was the high priest, and during the time of Christ, the high priest was usually appointed yearly by the Roman authorities. At the time of Christ, there were as many as 12 ex-priests serving on the Sanhedrin. Yes, sir. No, the Lesser Sanhedrin was located in various regions around Judea. So there are several of them in different locations. There could have been, but their jurisdiction would have been just Galilee. Right, but not the Great Sanhedrin. The Great Sanhedrin served as a Supreme Court for all Jewish law. They would handle all the matters that came to them that were unresolved at the lower court level. And we discussed the Sadducees, the Pharisees. We didn't get to the scribes. The scribes could be both Pharisees and Sadducees. They were the so-called literate, educated group. They were the ones responsible for copying of the Torah. They spent a lot of time studying the law. Scribes and lawyers sometimes are used interchangeably as being the same people, but scribes came from both the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And but the Great Sanhedrin consisted of scribes, Pharisees, and Sadducees. They generally would work together, even though politically they were oftentimes opposed to one another because they had differing views of the interpretation of Old Testament law. And under the Romans, the Great Sanhedrin had jurisdiction only over Jerusalem and Judea. And as I mentioned, they had no jurisdiction in Galilee. This is the Great Sanhedrin, and therefore they were unable to lawfully seize Jesus. The Great Sanhedrin met in a special court called the Hall of Hewn Stone. This was actually built into the temple, half in, half out. The Hall of Hewn Stone could be accessed both from the outside, from an outside door, and from an interior door that led directly into the temple. But it was a separate place, and this is where legal matters were supposed to have occurred. All judgments were supposed to occur within this specific location, the Hall of Hewn Stone. And we're going to see later, we're going to look at the Sanhedrin and the illegalities of Christ's trial based on Jewish law. They violated Jewish law on many points in order to accomplish the murder of Christ. And one of them was that the judgment of death against Christ was made in an illegal place in the house of Caiaphas. The Sanhedrin, the Romans, they continued the policy that the other Gentile conquerors, beginning with the Persians, had adopted. That was to basically allow the local individuals to govern themselves semi-autonomously. They're allowed to worship and to conduct themselves according to their own local laws, and as long as they paid their taxes and kept the peace, no effort was made to interfere. And this was continued by the Romans, and they gave great latitude to the Great Sanhedrin for judging civil matters. And they did have the power to pronounce death sentences, but Rome had to approve the death sentence before the execution could be carried out. So we see when we talk about the execution of Christ, they take Christ to Pilate because they need to get Pilate's approval and really coerce Pilate into carrying out the death sentence against Christ. The Great Sanhedrin, they had powers that the Lessers didn't have. They had the power to try a Jewish king. They also had power to try what they thought was a false prophet, and they had the power to extend the boundaries of both Jerusalem and the temple. And the Talmud dates the founding of the Sanhedrin back to the time of Moses. You recall in, I think it's Numbers 11, 16 to 12, where Moses sets up this, or the Lord instructs Moses to set up this council of, I think it was 70 elders, in order to help judge some of the matters that Moses was taking on for himself. He set up this panel to help carry the load of governing the people and judging their disputes. But most of the commentators and historians that I have read, they date the Sanhedrin at the time of Christ to the Ptolemaic and the Seleucid era, or the Hellenistic era. It came into existence during that period of time, from the beginning of the Greek Empire up until the time of Christ. Now, biblical references to the Sanhedrin. You do not find the word Sanhedrin anywhere in the Bible. I looked up in two of my concordances just to be sure, and you cannot find Sanhedrin in the Bible, but you do see it indirectly referenced numerous times, and you know it's the Sanhedrin that they're talking about. When you see the word council, usually is a reference to the Sanhedrin, when there's the council gets together. With regard to Jesus, it was the council, the chief priests, the elders that were going after Christ in these passages, and this is unquestionably, in my mind, the Sanhedrin. Also in Stephen, when Stephen appears before the council in Acts 6, 12, and 15, he becomes the first martyr of the Christian church. It was the Sanhedrin that he appeared before. I also find it interesting that the first martyr of the church was not a pastor, he was not an apostle, but he was a deacon. So I think it should be, we ought to be willing to be martyred for the faith, even before our pastor is, I think. But I think it sets the pattern, the importance of the office of deacon. And then Paul appeared before the Sanhedrin on a number of occasions. Even Paul was wise enough and shrewd enough to realize in one of these occasions that half the Sanhedrin was Sadducee, half was Pharisee. He understood that the Sadducees did not recognize the resurrection, the Pharisees did, and he was able to use that to cause the Sanhedrin to divide. And the Pharisees pronounced there was nothing worthy of death for Paul and the Sadducees because they did not believe in the resurrection. Paul was able to use that and to really use that to divide the council. We also see reference to elders, chiefs, priests, and scribes, who are often, you usually will find all of these together in a passage, and it usually also is a reference to the Sanhedrin in regard to Jesus with these passages, Peter and John in Acts 4:23. And then Paul, again, we see elders, chief priests, and scribes, where it's the Sanhedrin that these guys are being accused by. And then again, the most noteworthy and significant appearance of the Sanhedrin was in the trial and condemnation of Jesus. The Sanhedrin was behind this, was the driving force. The various members of the Sanhedrin may have had different motives for getting rid of Christ, but they are all agreed that Christ needed to be destroyed. Now, while pretending to be the guardians of Jewish law, they knowingly violated their own Jewish law in order to condemn Jesus and have him put to death. And I want to go over some of these. And we'll kind of look at how the Christ's death, Christ's trial was illegal, even according to Jewish law. And it really lays bare the hypocrisy of the Sanhedrin. So, first was those involved in the betrayal and arrest of Jesus had disqualified themselves as accusers and judges of Jesus by their own criminal acts. What do I mean by that? The judges, the chief priests, the Sanhedrin, they offered a bribe to Judas in order to betray and take Christ. So both Judas is the receiver of the bribe, the judges, the Sanhedrin, or the payers of the bribe, and any criminal system I am aware of, offering and taking a bribe is criminal. It is a criminal act. Now, Jewish law, the testimony of an accomplice, who would have been Judas, is not permissible by rabbinic law. No man's life, nor his liberty, nor his reputation can be endangered by the malice of one who has confessed himself a criminal. So Judas also had confessed himself to be one of Jesus' disciples. He's taken this bribe in order to betray Christ into the hands of the Sanhedrin. He took a bribe from those who would be Jesus' judges. Both were guilty of the criminal act of bribery, disqualifying themselves, according to Jewish law, from any part in the trial of Jesus. Second, Jesus was arrested at night before sunrise. According to Jewish law, a man charged with a capital crime had to be arrested in broad daylight. To avoid any question of impropriety or the possibility of taking the wrong man, a man arrested for a capital crime must be arrested in broad daylight. Now, we know that evil governments have gone the opposite way. When they want to do something in secret, they do it at night. The Nazis, they had a practice they called Nacht und Nebel, which was night and fog. If they wanted an enemy, they wanted to get rid of him, they would take him at night. He would disappear. Nobody would ever know what happened to him. He just would disappear from the face of the earth. But the Jews required that a person accused of a capital crime had to be arrested in broad daylight, not at night. Jesus was arrested without any charges or warrant having first been issued. It was, in modern legal terms, false arrest and false imprisonment. False arrest is an arrest without proper legal authority, and because you are retained and have no liberty, your false arrest also becomes a false imprisonment at the same time. Jesus was arrested before an indictment had been rendered against him. There was no warrant that we see in Scripture ahead of time. They arrested him first, and then they took him to the house of the high priest to try, and then tried to come up with their accusation against him at that time after he was arrested. Jesus' first trial occurred as a private night proceeding in the private residence of a former high priest. All proceedings by night were prohibited. An accused man was never to be subjected to a private or secret examination. All court proceedings were to take place in the hall of hewn stone, not in a private residence. Any proceeding taking place other than in the hall of hewn stone was considered to be illegal. The indictment against Jesus was false, therefore illegal. Indictments can only be, according to Jewish law, an indictment can only be initiated by an accusing witness, not by the Sanhedrin itself. A criminal case was initiated by a witness coming to the Sanhedrin and directly accusing the individual of whatever crime he thought he had committed. Indictments cannot originate from the Sanhedrin, but we see from the Scriptures that that's exactly what happened, that he was indicted by the members of the Sanhedrin. The testimony and evidence of leading witnesses constituted the charge. No witness had made any charge against Jesus before he was arrested. He was arrested, and then they searched for witnesses to accuse him. And his first examination was by Annas, and that brought forth no evidence of guilt. At that point, Jesus should have been released because they could find no evidence to hold him, nothing with which to accuse him. But rather than releasing him, they sent him on to Caiaphas. Contrary to Jewish law, the Sanhedrin illegally convened to try Jesus of a capital offense on a day before an annual Sabbath. Yes, of course, this was also contrary to Jewish law. Jewish law states that they shall not judge on the eve of the Sabbath nor on any festival. Jewish law stated that a person who was accused of a capital crime, a trial for capital offense in Jewish law had to take place within 2 days. And they had to be 2 consecutive days with only one night of adjournment between the first and the second day. They could not initiate a capital case on a Friday because then they would either have to convene again on the Sabbath or whatever the festival day was, which was illegal, or they'd have to adjourn for 2 nights, which again, according to Jewish law, was illegal. For a capital offense, somebody had to be tried on the first day, then the second day, the sentence of death, if that was the verdict, was passed on the second day. So we know that they brought Christ and accused him on the eve of the Passover. The trial of Jesus was illegal because it was commenced and concluded in 1 day. Again, as I said, a criminal case resulting in the acquittal of the accused may terminate the same day in which the trial began, but if a sentence of death is to be pronounced, it cannot be concluded before the following day to allow sufficient opportunity for any witnesses in support of the accused to present themselves. His trial was again illegal because his indictment against him was founded on Jesus' own uncorroborated statement. Sentence was pronounced on Jesus without any supporting evidence whatever. They asked him directly, "Are you the Son of God?" He answered in a way where they understood what he meant, that he was saying he was. but they didn't bring any other witnesses in order to corroborate Jesus' statement. So Jewish law, we have it as a fundamental principle of Jewish jurisprudence that no one can bring an accusation against himself. Should a man make a confession of guilt before a legally constituted tribunal, such confession is not to be used against him unless properly attested to by two other witnesses. No attempt is ever made to lead a man on to self-incrimination. Moreover, a voluntary confession on his part is not admitted in evidence and therefore not competent to convict him unless a legal number of witnesses minutely corroborate his self-accusation. The trial of Jesus was illegal because the merits of the defense were not considered. No impartial investigation of the matter was conducted. Now, this obviously, Christ's trial before the Sanhedrin was a kangaroo court, and it was a show trial for the sole purpose of getting rid of Christ and to get rid of him before anybody could act to intervene, which is why they arrested him at night, and why they, I think that many members of the Sanhedrin were not there, those who they thought would have spoken up in Jesus' defense. They made sure that everything was controlled so that Jesus would have no opportunity to defend himself and to be defended by anybody else. It's interesting, if you take this position, you look at this, this is the way the enemies of Christ have worked in the past. Probably one of the reformers who had the greatest impact on the English-speaking world was a guy named John Knox. He was just a fiery Scottish preacher, but before he came to Scotland to begin the Scottish Reformation, Scotland had already had its baptism of blood. They had had a martyr by the name of Patrick Hamilton. Patrick Hamilton had friends in high places, but the Cardinal Beaton, wanted to get rid of him because he hated the fact that he was out preaching the gospel, and he did it in a way where he did it quickly, he did it quietly, so that those who would defend him did not have a chance to come in and intervene. And so by the time they learned of Patrick Hamilton's death, it was already over and a done deal. And Beaton had his way. I think this is what's going on with Christ. Their objective is to quickly put Christ to death before anybody else, his supporters, could intervene on his behalf. Deuteronomy 13:14 says, this is in regard to if there's word that a city or a town has gone after other gods, they were to make an inquiry, to make a search, and to ask diligently. They to investigate the matter before they pronounce judgment on the city. The judges shall weigh the matter in the sincerity of their conscience. The trial of Jesus was also illegal because those who would have voted against condemnation of Jesus were not there. The scriptures do not record Nicodemus or Joseph of Arimathea being there. And it is apparent that the whole nature of the nighttime arrest, the nighttime trial in a private residence, was coordinated to ensure that there would be no dissenters against their pronouncement of condemnation on Christ. Like I said, there's no record of Nicodemus or any other supporters of the Sanhedrin being present at this trial. The trial of Jesus was also illegal because the vote to condemn him was spontaneous and unanimous. This was prohibited by Jewish law. A simultaneous and unanimous verdict of guilt rendered on the day of the trial has the effect of an acquittal. A man was not to be condemned until the second day of trial, so that the judges would have time to reflect and seriously consider their vote. The judges were to go home, eat a meal, sleep the night, and seriously reflect on their verdict before rendering the verdict. This did not occur when Christ was condemned. It happened all in a single day. The high priest, by his illegal act of rending his garment, prejudiced the others with a motion against Jesus. He violated the Levitical law in doing so. In Leviticus 21:10, and he who was the high priest among his brethren, on whose head the anointing oil was poured, and who was considered to wear the garments, shall not uncover his head nor tear his clothes. And the high priest did this, and he did it with a specific purpose. I think it was to inflame those in the Sanhedrin, and to arouse their emotions, and to prejudice them against Christ. The proper, as far as the method of voting, the proper method of voting is to have the judges each in his turn absolve or condemn. In ordinary cases, the judges voted according to seniority, the oldest commencing. In capital cases, the reverse order was followed, with the least senior members voting first, so as not to have their decisions influenced by the senior members. This did not happen with Christ. They all condemned him spontaneously and unanimously. If none of the judges defend the culprit, all pronounce him guilty, Having not defender in the court, the verdict of guilty was invalid, and the sentence of death could not be executed, according to Jewish law. The sentence against Jesus was illegal because it was pronounced in a place forbidden by Jewish law. The sentence of death in the house of the high priest was against Jewish law. A sentence of death can be pronounced only so long as the Sanhedrin holds its sessions in the appointed place, the Hall of Hewn Stone. After leaving the Hall of Hewn Stone, no sentence of death can be passed upon anyone soever. The sentence against Jesus was illegal because most of the Sanhedrin members were themselves legally disqualified to try Jesus on at least 3 points. One, most had achieved their positions by bribery, by political favors, by appointment by family members who had no right to sit on the Sanhedrin. Joseph lists 10 members who we know for sure who were accused of these indiscretions that were serving on the Sanhedrin. The position of high priest was intended to be an appointment for life. The high priest was supposed to serve until he died, and then someone else would take his place. At the time of Jesus' appearance before the Sanhedrin, the judges were appointed on a yearly basis by the Roman authorities. And as I said before, there were as many as 12 ex-high priests sitting in the Sanhedrin, all of whom would have an undue amount of influence on the junior members of the Sanhedrin. And then I would say probably all of the judges that he appeared before were Jesus' sworn enemies, and he even paid bribe money to get their hands on him. Nor must there be in the judicial bench either a relation or a particular friend or an enemy of either the accused or the accuser, nor under any circumstance is a man known to be at enmity with the accused person permitted to occupy a position among his judges. And clearly this was not the case with Christ. Every one of those judges was a personal, avowed enemy of Christ. Let's see. And then his sentence was illegal because they kept changing the charges. They kept bringing a new charge. First, the charge was that he would destroy the temple and raise it again in 3 days. Then they changed the charge to blasphemy, and then to get Pilate to go along with the charge and do their dirty work of killing him, they changed the charge to sedition and treason. Let's see. And then finally, the sentence against Jesus was illegal because the Sanhedrin was willing to suborn perjury. Jewish law, Exodus 20:16, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. Matthew 26:60, but found none, yea, though many false witnesses came, yet they found none. At the last came 2 false witnesses. So that the charge against Christ was brought forth by 2 known false witnesses, contrary to Jewish Levitical law. So I think I'm going to stop there. What I had hoped to have time to do, maybe I'll pick it up in the fall, is I wanted to look at something called, I couldn't find a name for it, so I call it the economy, the divine economy of contrasting opposites. As you go into the scripture, you'll find things that appear to be opposite each other, and I wanted to then apply it to the crucifixion of Christ. Like Christ says, in my kingdom the first shall be last, the last shall be first. He says, he who seeks his life will lose it, but he who loses his life for my sake will find it. He tells Joseph, as a type of Christ, tells his brethren, you meant it to me for evil, but God meant it for good. So these apparent opposite things, I wanted to take those and apply them to the crucifixion, and how the various things Christ did and suffered, they suffered them so that we would enjoy the opposite blessing as a result of what he did. But we don't have time, so we'll maybe pick it up next week or next